Hello, and welcome to the National Eye Institute at Risk. Key Insights for Vision Scientists, a collaborative webinar by ARVO, National Alliance for Eye and Vision Research, and the Alliance for Eye and Vision Research, as well as Bright Focus Foundation. I'm Judy Hill. I'm the Communications and Events Director at the National Alliance for Eye and Vision Research and the Alliance for Eye and Vision Research, and I'm absolutely thrilled to have you with us today. Before we dive in, I'd like to just cover a few housekeeping items, please. This webinar is being recorded and will be available at Arvo Learn and Arvo's YouTube channel within the next 2 to 3 business days, so keep an eye out for that. If you have any questions during the webinar, please use the chat feature to ask them. I'll be monitoring and will do my best to address as many of those as I can throughout the session. For anonymous questions, please feel free to use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom window. Lastly, we would love your feedback, so please take a moment to complete the survey at the end of this webinar. It helps us improve for future events. So I'm delighted to introduce our speakers today. We have Dan Ignazewski. He's the Executive Director at the National Alliance for Eye and Vision Research, as well as the Alliance for Eye and Vision Research. Dr. Priti Subramanian, Vision Science Programs Director at the Bright Focus Foundation, and Stacy Holler, President and CEO of the Bright Focus Foundation. And we're very grateful for their time and insights on this critical topic today. And with that, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Dan to kick things off.
All right. Thank you very much, Judy. We do have a lot to cover today, so please make sure to, if you do have questions as we go, we'll try our best to address them throughout the conversation here. But we'll also have some time at the end for Q&A. So please populate the Q&A area in the chat to let us know if you have any questions. But we're going to go ahead and dig in on what's going on. And I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with the NIH report, a reform report that came out earlier this summer. Some of you may not be as familiar with the Senate white paper that was also published back in May of this year. We're going to focus on the House report because that's the one that really is pertinent to today's conversation. But I do want people to be aware that, you know, in May, there was a white paper that was published by the House or by the Senate, Senator Bill Cassidy from Louisiana, Republican from Louisiana, where he had actually sought input from community stakeholders and basically provided some recommendations on efficiencies, piloting new strategies and for new ideas in research and how to conduct research and how to fund research, looking at restoring trust and transparency across NIH. And one of the big recommendations that came out of that was a recommendation to reconvene the NIH's Scientific Management and Review Board, or SMRB. There were no specific recommendations within that Senate white paper around consolidation or restructuring of NIH. There were some references to the fact that the SMRB was originally convened and supported by Congress to have reporting on a regular basis from NIH about ways to continue to improve and innovate and ensure efficiencies across NIH. Unfortunately, the SMRB has not convened for a number of years, and so that's why that recommendation was established to reconvene the NIH's Scientific Management Review Board. Before I go on to the House side, we do have some already really good news where NIH has proactively taken that recommendation and reinstituted that board to be able to help with the transparency and reporting requirements for Congress. And Director Mike Chang has been nominated to have a seat on that board. So that I think will bode very well for vision research and vision science. Onto the House report, which was published in June, which many people are probably more aware of, and really is going to be the focus of today's conversation. That House report was published by the chair of the Energy and Commerce Committee in the House. And right now, with the House being controlled by the Republican conference, it was published by the chair, Cathy McMorris Rodgers, who's a Republican from Washington State. In that report, there were some significant changes and recommendations for how to change and modify how NIH is structured. The biggest piece of that report was really focused on structural reform. There were conversations and recommendations in there around improved transparency, better reporting and oversight. There were also recommendations for having director term limits. And they also had some recommendations in there about re-examining and identifying opportunities to modify or improve the ways that they look at indirect costs at NIH. The biggest piece of this and the biggest concern that we have, given the fact that it's made its way into legislative text, is this restructuring of the NIH. And essentially what the recommendation proposed was a consolidation from 27 institutes and centers currently at NIH down to 15. And part of the reason I'm guessing you all are here today is because you all realize and recognize that one of those consolidated proposals was centered on consolidating the National Eye Institute with a larger Institute on Neuroscience and Brain Research that would encompass the NEI, as well as the National Institute of Neurological Disorders and Stroke, or NINDS, and the National Institute of Dental and Craniofacial Research, NIDCR. So that's the big concern that we're going to focus on today, because that's the thing that I think right now has the biggest focus from a congressional perspective on what they're trying to accomplish. So when we're looking at this congressional perspective, and I mentioned that this proposal, it was advanced not only from the report that was published in June, but also then included in legislative text. What I mean by that is the Congress has to pass a budget every year, and when we're passing a budget, we basically segment the budget out into different departments and areas of focus for Congress to sort of pass individual bills that ultimately go into the overall budget. And what happened earlier this year was, following that report, the NIH reform report, the House actually published in legislative text the recommendations to consolidate all of those institute in the Labor, Health, and Human Services bill. And that's the bill that funds the NIH. And the big difference here between a white paper, a reform report that we saw from the House, and legislative text is, a white paper typically takes recommendations and guidance from stakeholders, provides, fact-based information about what the recommendations and ideas are coming about in that space. The report is when it's just a report, it's a report that provides recommendations, provides guidance, and really looks at how things are currently being done, tries to address some of those through their recommendations. It's not until we get to legislative text where the threat really significantly increases. And what happened earlier this year in the summer was the House included this consolidation in their Labor H bill, LHHS bill, and then it was passed when they reviewed the bill. It was passed on a party line vote, Republicans voting in favor of it, Democrats voting opposed to it, to pass the overall bill. The Labor H bill includes not just NIH funding, it also includes all of Health and Human Services, education, and other areas. But this NIH reform proposal was included, and there were no amendments that were accepted to change the proposal and the recommendations that were included in this legislative text. So the House advanced the bill out of the subcommittee and also by the full committee. And both votes from the subcommittee and the full committee were on party line votes. So again, Republicans in favor, Democrats were opposed. It has not been taken up by the full House and is not likely to be taken up by the full House this year. The main reason for that is because Congress is supposed to pass a budget by the end of September every year. It's been a long time since that has happened. But they, instead of passing a full budget in September, which they were unable to do, they've passed what some of you may be familiar with, which is a continuing resolution, or a CR. And that funding bill currently funds the federal government through December 16th of this year. So we're waiting until Congress sort of elected to wait until after the elections, kind of see the results of the elections, and then hopefully include a full year-long budget that would get us to September 2025 for next year's budget. That continuing resolution funds the current government basically at the same levels that it's been over the last year. And it does not include the NIH consolidation that was proposed or that was included in the Labor H bill. So we're very encouraged by that, and we are confident that with the support from the Senate and the current makeup of the White House, that any of this reform proposal is unlikely to be taken up or advanced in the final budget discussions later this year that'll occur sometime in December. So how would this overall proposal impact vision research? Some of you, again, may be aware of this if you've been tracking and monitoring some of this issue throughout the summer and into the fall. But ultimately, the big one that we're worried about is this Institute on Neuroscience and Brain Research. And vision research, originally, when it was funded through NIH, was a part of what at the time was sort of the equivalent of NINDS. And it was focused on neurological and vision and eye research. I think it was actually and blindness was the term that was used in the NIH's title. That was back in the 50s and 60s, and since the 60s when NIH had the recommendation from Congress through advocacy efforts to push NEI into an independent institute. We've been operating with NEI as an independent institute ever since. So our concern is that there was a recognition at that time that vision really does need its own unique funding. And our concern of going back into a neuroscience and brain research institute is that the vision focus really could get lost. When you think about the general public and general understanding of health and sort of medical science, when the general public sees Institute on Neuroscience and Brain Research, they're probably not thinking of vision. And over time, Congress may lose some of that as well, and NIH may even lose some of that as well if we were to move forward with a consolidation like this. So the concern is that vision could get lost. Priorities could also shift on an annual basis. Without a dedicated funding line for vision researchers, you could see wild swings in the amount of funding that goes to traditional vision research. And that could happen on an annual basis, not necessarily from the overall funding level of an Institute on Neuroscience and Brain Research, but from the specific proposals and research proposals that are recommended for funding and supported. Those could be adjusted on an annual basis. The funding could significantly shift on an annual basis if you've got neuroscience, brain research, and vision, and dental and cranial. The priorities of the director of that institute, the focus of that institute, the mission of that institute, all of the theories of what that could look like would be troubling and would not necessarily provide a sort of long-term stability for vision research. And then the big question too is also what happens to eye research that's not tied to the neurological system. So what happens to front of the eye research and where do we go with some of those advances? So that's the big thing that we're going to focus on today. Again, is this consolidation, because not only was it included in the report, but it was included in the legislative text for the Labor Age Bill. Some of the other proposals, things within the proposal that were not included in the Labor Age Bill, but will be part of the conversation likely moving forward, are the idea behind director term limits. The proposal recommended a 5-year term limit with an option for a second 5-year term, which would potentially limit a director for 1 or 2 grant cycles, which really doesn't provide, again, that long-term stability that provides sort of direction and guidance for researchers to know kind of where funding priorities will go and what the needs of and the direction of NIH funding will be. And that could, again, result in significant shifts to the strategy and direction of the institute. Transparency and accountability, frankly, from NAVER's perspective and from a lot of the advocacy community around NIH, we're always going to be supportive of transparency and accountability, looking at ways to ensure proper reporting and oversight of NIH. All of that, I think, is important. And so there were recommendations in there. We're not going to tell Congress what they need or don't need from that perspective, but I think that it's also important to understand that as a general principle, obviously, transparency and accountability are something that the advocacy community is supportive of. And then the other thing that did not make it into the legislative text, but was a part of the report, was re-examining funding and looking at potential future caps or significant changes to indirect rates and how they fund different research projects. And so we recognize that's a big issue and a big challenge. It was not the main focus of our response because, again, it has not advanced into legislative text or anything that way. So we're keeping an eye on that. But again, our main focus today is really centered on this idea of the consolidation for neuroscience and brain research. And I'm going to invite my colleagues and partners from Bright Focus on now to just provide a little bit of insight from their perspective about how this proposal would impact vision research and why we're all pushing against this. So Stacy and Preeti.
Thank you, Dan. And good afternoon to listeners. I'm Stacy, and I'm president and CEO of the Bright Focus Foundation. We are a nonprofit that funds research in the U.S. and globally to end age-related diseases of the eye and brain. So that sort of puts us in a sweet spot as you listen to Dan talk about the potential threat that exists for NEI and other parts of NIH. One of the things that I think is crucial in this discussion is to understand that here are, in this chart, an indication of those people diagnosed worldwide with the vision diseases today of 280 million. And these numbers that you're looking at on the chart are expected to double by 2050. So the demand for understanding these age-related brain and vision diseases is skyrocketing and is getting attention by other countries and governments for the first time in a way that's really beneficial. But what I want to really call out, Dan, if we can go to the next slide, is that most people don't seem to think about the eye and eye health as a gateway to overall health. At Bright Focus, we're often saying that the eye is the window to the brain. And in the spirit of diseases and these neurodegenerative diseases, it makes a whole lot of sense for there to be more collaboration and understanding and cross-disease information. But what is missed in all of this is the understanding that eye health has much broader implications for our systemic health and for the delivery of non-invasive diagnostics. And so eye research, eye care, eye health is so much more than the diseases of the brain and eye, which may in part be fueling some of the thinking behind this realignment at NEI. So that's a really important piece to understand. And so having some education and understanding that a strong NEI is great for healthy aging as well as eye care. I mean, there are two things people fear most in all the studies that come out: losing their mind memories and their sight. And so much more of sight and saving sight has to do with matters that are outside the scope of the direct research that we fund. And it would be a tragedy to see NEI lumped in with neurodegenerative research exclusively, plus all the points Dan makes about the diminishing research funds and the shifting priorities that can happen. Actually, one of the points also is that you need the stakeholders, especially members of the scientific community, to engage and educate their institutional leaders as well that may not know, but importantly, whatever part of your academic life that has liaisons for state and federal members of Congress to understand the science, and most importantly, to understand without stakeholder involvement, they will make a mess of NIH through legislation that doesn't include those that know it best. And it needs to stay fluid. And sure, there may be some adjustments that need to be made to NIH, but those should come from the scientific community. And so part of that message that I want to leave with you today, as Dan continues, and Preeti will talk to you in a moment, is you have to become a voice. Because once something hits legislation, the risk for change is that much greater. And until some other option develops that may make more sense, it's important that we all take this more as a serious threat It may not be this year, it may not even be next year, but once it's in legislation, it has a way of staying alive for longer than any of us would like to see. Next. So with this, I'd like to have Preeti join us and talk a little bit about when NEI was separated from neuroscience, the absolutely critical discoveries and advances that have been made in eye research that probably wouldn't have happened. I would say wouldn't have happened without the efforts of NEI and foundations like ours that fund early stage research that then gets picked up by NEI and other and industry. So with that, look forward to answering any questions. And I hope that you feel some urgency around getting yourself and your colleagues involved in what they can do to help keep something happening that we all know is not in the best interests of science. Preeti?
Thank you, Stacy. Hi, everyone. I'm Preeti Subramanian, Director of Vision Science Programs at Bright Focus Foundation. Happy to be participating in today's panel discussion. I want to highlight a few examples of the advances that have been possible. And as Stacy mentioned, most of these have been possible because of the perseverance and investment of NEI and eye research leading the way in innovation and the impact that this has had beyond eye research. So the first FDA-approved gene therapy for an inherited eye disease, paving the way for future research into gene therapies, happened in the eye research field. Advanced imaging technologies, the introduction of optical coherence tomography, OCT, has revolutionized ophthalmic diagnostics. A non-invasive imaging technique that provides high-resolution cross-sectional images of the retina and other ocular structures, enabling early detection and precise monitoring of various eye conditions. So OCT has become an indispensable tool in ophthalmology, enhancing both clinical practice and also research opportunities. Artificial intelligence in ophthalmology has made significant strides in eye care, particularly in improving diagnostic accuracy. And a notable example is the FDA approval of the first AI system that autonomously detects diabetic retinopathy from retinal images. And this has potential to enhance screening processes and early interventions in eye diseases. There's also been a lot of development made in big data applications. Ophthalmology has been in the forefront for leveraging big data in healthcare research and clinical practice. And there are a number of initiatives around data-driven approaches by NEI to improve patient outcomes and also to be more efficient with healthcare delivery. And the last point here that I have is about the eye-brain connection and the systemic health. So vision research has expanded beyond ocular health, as Stacey mentioned, recognizing that eye is a window to overall health, with the potential for using eye as an examination window for other systemic conditions that include diabetes, hypertension, cardiovascular disease, and neurodegenerative disorders like Parkinson's and Alzheimer's. So this holistic approach to eye care has opened new avenues for early detection, management of various health issues. So although the eye and the brain may be interconnected in some way, they do demand different scientific approaches. And the eye should be looked by researchers as a whole organ, especially since there are a lot of things that we don't understand about the different cell types, the different signaling mechanism that influences diseases. And so maintaining the NEI would ensure that the unique challenges that of eye health and vision science that is beyond the neurological diseases are given enough focus and attention, and that there are resources that are dedicated for advancing our understanding of all ocular conditions and having treatment for all ocular conditions, including the ones that are not directly involved with the neural tissue. So with that, happy to answer any questions, and I would pass it on back to Dan to talk, to continue the discussion on how we can move this forward.
All right, thank you very much, Stacy and Preeti. And I think we're going to cover a couple of things as we kind of help everybody understand what our response to this has been. So obviously we're concerned with the consolidation. We have pushed back significantly on the consolidation. Here at the National Alliance for Eye and Vision Research, we have obviously developed an initial strategy when the first white paper from the Senate and then that House Reform Report were produced back in May and June, respectively. We sort of developed an initial strategy because, again, they weren't legislative text at the time. So it was sort of a targeted approach in terms of how we would respond and engage the community. But that changed very quickly because, as you can see, we reevaluated that response about 2 weeks later when the House released the Labor, Health, and Human Services Appropriations Bill, which, again, is that bill that funds NIH and other institutes and agencies. Where they included that restructuring in their bill. And specifically, there was not a funding line for the National Eye Institute in the House's Labor, Health, and Human Services bill. It was a funding line for this idea of a neuroscience and brain research institute. So that was where we reevaluated it. Based on some of the ongoing advocacy activities that the National Alliance for Eye and Vision Research participates in every year. On June 25th, right before that report came out from the Labor H committee, we actually signed on to a non-defense discretionary letter with over 1,100 other organizations, emphasizing we want the maximum funding level allowed across all of the agencies within the Labor H bill. And then on June 26th, we immediately started meeting with some of our partners. So when the bill came out, we reached out to Director Mike Chain to let him know that we would be planning a response. We also reached out to some of our other partners. We met with the following day. We immediately met with the American Dental Association, the American Association of Neurological Surgeons, the Society for Neuroscience, and really, the focus was to establish a commitment and messaging to push back on the NIH consolidation. And each of the groups did a little bit, had a little bit of a different approach in terms of how they advocated and how they pushed back against this. But everybody was on the same page that this was something that we were not in favor of, this idea of the Consolidated Institute for NEI, NINDS, and the Dental and Cranial Institute. So following that, we met with the Coalition for Health Funding, which is also a group of several advocacy organizations that are focused on NIH funding. And we initiated a response that was sent to Congress in early July. We also met with over 20 congressional offices that are focused on the Labor H bill, Democratic and Republican offices, to share our concern around the vision community's response to this and the concern that the impact would have on vision research. Over the middle of July to beginning of August, we met with a number of our partners, many of our partners, including ARVO, AAO, AA Optom, AOA, AUPO, all of these groups. Bright Focus Foundation were among all of those groups that we worked with. And our goal in those meetings was to communicate strategy in our advocacy plans and coordinate our response to make sure that the entire vision community was having a shared voice on this issue, pushing back on this. In early July, we sent an update helping people understand what was happening with the NIH report. In mid-July, we sent sign-on letters to some of our partners, our founding members, ARVO, AUPO, and AAO, for review and input. And then we, put those notes together, pulled those together, and shared a broad sign-on letter for the vision community back on July 23rd. That was ultimately signed by over 100 different organizations, institutes, nonprofit patient advocacy groups, and foundations. And we really appreciate the vision community's support around that letter. We were able to send that letter up to Congress as well. We also developed a personal advocacy letter, and hopefully everybody here on the call has already done that. Sent that advocacy letter into your members of Congress. It's a great way for us to be able to engage the community and let members know what our concerns are with this consolidation and what the impact would be on vision researchers. So we've done all of that. We focused heavily on communications and social media to get our message out. We also did an interview with Helio about the NIH reform, where they produced an initial article and then did a follow-up video with NAVER and Bright Focus Foundation. And those are all available. We can make sure to link those to the attendees in the follow-up from this webinar as well. So in terms of the actual response that we've received from the vision community, it has been substantial and impressive. We had over 100 signatories to the sign-on letter, as I mentioned. In addition to that sign-on letter, we also had over 5,100 letters that were sent to members of Congress from 44 different states. We are still trying to get all 50 states, so if you are in one of these states that is grayed out, we'd love to have letters from those states as well. But you can see that this was a substantial issue for vision researchers, patients, patient advocates, care providers, and professionals that treat people with vision loss and vision impairment. And so we've seen significant response. 5,000 letters, over 5,000 letters is significant and a substantial way to let Congress know that there is significant concern around this consolidation proposal. So we did that. We also had an organizational response from NAVER and some of our other partners that were sent directly to the Energy and Commerce Committee around what our concerns were with the consolidation and how we felt like we wanted to be included. And Stacy brought up a great point before that we really feel that any recommendation for NIH reform, whether there's whether this proposal or future proposals are produced, we do feel strongly that the vision community, the researchers, the patients, and the providers are able to have input and provide stakeholder input to help to address some of this and help make sure Congress understands exactly what the concerns are and the issues are with a proposal like this. So what are some of the things that you can do? In case you didn't know and haven't been paying attention, you might have been living under a rock, because I think that it's been a busy year, but it is an election season. We've got an election next Tuesday, and one of the biggest things you can do is vote, be educated on the issues, vote on these issues, and understand that there was a party line divide with the support for this proposal in the House. Again, it didn't receive full House consideration. It was within the Labor H subcommittee on appropriations and the full appropriations committee. So those members, it was a party line vote to advance that legislation. And while it has not been brought up in the overall House for consideration for all members to vote on, it is important to understand that this has been initiated from the Republican side of the aisle. It's a Republican idea. You can also advocate, and sort of, what does it mean to be an advocate? The easiest thing that you can do is you can send a letter from NAVER's website. We have a template letter ready for you to go. It's all set and drafted for you. You can actually use the QR code here at the right of your screen, and you can send a letter to your members. It's populated, it is drafted. You can send it as is, or you can make adjustments or modifications to it. We encourage people to make modifications to it. Talk about your research, talk about some of the things that you're doing that you're concerned with that might not be able to be continued for funding or might be at risk if a consolidation like this were to move forward. So please use that QR code. If you've already sent a letter, I thank you for that. It doesn't hurt to send another one. And if you have not sent a letter yet, again, we really encourage you to take action now and send a letter to your members of Congress that help them understand why we're concerned about this issue. You can also call your House and Senate offices and share some of the talking points that are within that letter. We'll also share a couple of other things in just a moment about things that you can say and talking points that you can use when you communicate, both sending the letter from Neighbor's website or calling the House and Senate to let them know about your concerns. The biggest thing is we really need to keep this issue in front of Congress and in front of leaders in the vision community and leaders at your institutes, leaders in your communities. It's really important that people stay apprised of what's happening here. Again, it moved very quickly from a report to legislative text. We don't want to be caught flat-footed where this somehow looks to advance in the future without the vision community's response and engagement. So we're really focused on that. Make sure to keep your institution's leadership apprised of some of this. And look at ways that you can stay updated and available. One of those ways is you can sign up for Neighbor AVER updates. That's the bottom QR code here on your screen. So you can actually sign up for that. Name and email address is pretty much all we need. And then that way we can send you our monthly updates, which will continue to track and monitor this issue and provide additional insights. You'll also be able to use the Neighbor AVER toolkit and some of our advocacy documents that we're making available to ARVO and to our partners to make sure that we can help advocate and educate about some of these issues and what it means for vision researchers. So when you are talking with legislators, when you're drafting a letter, these are kind of the three big things that we always tell folks when you advocate. The three things that you want to accomplish in your message, whether it's a letter, a call, or a meeting, is we want you to tell your story, help people understand who you are and why it matters. So if you're a researcher, tell your story about what got you involved in research, what your research focus is, help them understand a little bit of your background. They want to know about you as a constituent. What makes you who you are and why are you interested in this issue? Then you can define the issue. Defining the issue is, there's this NIH reform report. We have significant concerns from the vision research community, from the patient community, and from the provider community around what this will do to advancements in vision science in the future. So you can help define that. And then you can make the ask. And our ask right now is do not consolidate the National Eye Institute into the larger proposed Institute on Neuroscience and Brain Research. So that's kind of the three big bullet points that we focus on. When you are talking with Congress, it's very important to remember you're not talking to another clinician, you're not talking to another researcher, you're not talking to patients. You're talking to policymakers that are knowledgeable about healthcare policy and things in that space. So when you talk with them, you're not going to be able to relate to them at the same level that you would with a peer in the research or provider community. And so at a very high level, when you convey messages and advocate, we want you to talk about the disease incidence, the growth of disease, and the burden on patients. Stacy already mentioned some of that with macular degeneration as an example. Those are the kinds of things you want to start the conversation out with. Help them understand what is the disease that you research, what is the disease that you or condition that you have that you may be able to talk more about and help them understand how it impacts vision. It's been a long time for some of these folks that they've probably taken a biology class and they've probably forgotten the different areas of the eye. So it's really important to understand that you've got to come at these advocacy points at a very high level. Talk about the distinctive need for vision research. Why do we need to continue to advance research? What is needed and what are the benefits of that? Talk about the benefits to patients, talk about the benefits of research, talk about the impact that it has on future care, future pipelines, future discoveries, and how we can treat and hopefully cure or potentially restore vision in the future. And talk about what research means, how research really helps go from the basic science to the translational to the clinical to ultimately, new treatments, cures, and understanding that can help us improve vision loss and vision impairment in this country. So I do want to encourage everybody to again, fill out those letters and send those letters to Congress, give them a call. Other ways you can also get involved is you can participate in NAVER's Emerging Vision Scientist program. We will have applications for that sometime this spring in 2025. That event takes place in September every year, and we will continue that. And this will likely be a big focus of that discussion and those advocacy efforts next year. We also partner with ARVO on their advocacy day, and there are great opportunities to look at how you can support ARVO and some of the advocacy efforts that they're doing as well. A couple of other key messages, again, at a very high level. Over 90 million Americans over 40 experience some form of vision impairment. Stacy touched on this, but eye disease in several areas is projected to double in the next 25 years. Myopia is projected to impact 50% of the global population by 2030. Again, some of this may be funding that would be impacted by a consolidation of the institutes. Help them understand that restructuring would dilute the specialized attention that's needed for vision, and kind of take the focus away and may reduce funding and available research dollars in the future. Help people understand that many eye diseases don't involve the central nervous system or the peripheral nervous system, which really doesn't make it as compatible with neurological diseases and conditions. Pretty touched on this, and I think it's really important to note that the eye really does serve as a unique model for medical research. It's got a lot of different systems within the eye that you can study, that you can look at for indications and for methods of systematic treatment and addressing systemic disease. So really helping people understand that focus. And then really pointing out some of these high-level achievements that vision researchers have made, which likely would not have been possible if vision research hadn't been specifically funded separately and distinctly as an institute at NIH. So those are all things that you can use in your advocacy messages. Some of those are included in our existing template letter, but you can use some of those examples for some of your advocacy efforts and engagement as well. Now, I mentioned before that we have an election coming up next week, and I want to kind of address what's going to happen this year. I think that it's important to understand that while this proposal is unlikely to advance this year, which is very good news, we've got this continuing resolution to mid-December, and then they'll hopefully pass a year-long budget that will not include this consolidation. Next year is a whole new Congress. And we know that because the entire House is up for re-election, and 1/3 of the Senate is up for election, and the White House is obviously up for grabs. And so I'm going to address some of the potential election outcomes and what the impact might be on this proposal, depending on some of these potential outcomes. I'm going to preface this by saying that this is all based on consensus polling projections, not based on any sort of prognostication from ARVO or NAVER or Bright Focus Foundation. This is just some of where current polling sits across the country as sort of a consolidation of polls. So impact of the election outcomes. Currently, the House is in Republican control. That's where this report came from that proposed the consolidation. And if the House remains in Republican control, I would say that there is a high likelihood that the NIH consolidation proposal would be reintroduced and advanced like it was this year. This would probably include a report that sort of took in some of the feedback that the House got from the initial proposal. It would likely include hearings, and it, again, could include legislation not limited to the Labor, Health, and Human Services bill, but also potentially in other legislative text that could try to address not only the consolidation, but some of the other structural and reporting requirements and things like that were outlined in the report. So if the House remains in Republican control, I would say there's a high likelihood that it would be reintroduced and likely advanced as it was this year. If Democrats take the House, they need a few seats to pick up to be able to take over the House. Then it would be unlikely to be introduced or advanced with the consolidation proposals. But there would probably be some recommendations that come out of the discussions with Congress as they negotiate bills and legislative text. There may also be some reports or follow-up that the Republican Party may put forward from a response. But it would be unlikely that Democrats, based on the voting of the Labor, Health, and Human Services Subcommittee and the overall Appropriations Committee, it would be unlikely that Democrats would advance any legislation that would consolidate the National Institutes of Health. Moving on to the Senate. Right now, the Senate is controlled by the Democratic Party. If the Senate remains under Democratic control, there's, again, a low likelihood that the NIH consolidation proposal would move forward from the House, regardless of the outcome in the House. Additional follow-up recommendations from the Senate White Paper, which, again, came out in May of this year and was sort of a report around recommendations and feedback that they got from stakeholders. There may be some follow-up and some recommendations and adjustments that are made from that, but it would be unlikely that a Democratic-controlled Senate would advance legislation that consolidated the NIH. If Republicans do take the Senate, which currently is shown as a high likelihood or a moderate likelihood, Republicans would likely look to advance priorities that were identified in the Senate White Paper, which, again, does not include the consolidation. But they would also be open to, possibly supporting their House colleagues and moving forward with some of the recommendations that are in the NIH reform report that came from the House. And that's obviously of concern because we don't know what they would support and what they would not support if the Republicans controlled the Senate, if they would go along with the House reform report recommendations, or if they would make modifications to that. But it would be more likely that they would have some sort of action that followed up from at least the Senate White Paper, and may also include some feedback and movement toward the House in terms of their recommendations if that legislation is also advanced in the House. Now, the White House, if the White House is currently in Democratic control, if it remains in Democratic control, again, there's a low likelihood that NIH consolidation proposal would be supported at the White House level. The White House came out against the recommendation earlier this summer when it was introduced in legislative text with the Labor H bill. And it's important to just understand that that's something that, if Democrats continue to control the White House, if it's a Harris administration, it would be less likely to be supported or signed off on from the White House. If Republicans win the White House, there's no formal statement or recommendation right now from the potential Trump administration on whether their administration would support the House proposal. Although, support would be more likely, given that the previous Trump administration had recommended significant cuts to NIH and some other HHS agencies under the previous Trump administration. And so there may be additional support for the House proposal or recommendations that they would be more likely to consider if Republicans win the White House. So right now, there's a lot of different ways that this can swing. I'm sure if you're following the news at all, you're hearing that this is a very close election, and that's true across all three areas of the government: House, Senate, and White House. And ultimately, we think that based on the consensus polling, the Democratic House, Republican Senate, and Democratic White House is likely. But there's a chance of Senate introduction. It would be unlikely to advance and would require a lot of education and advocacy to support this. If regardless of the outcome of the election, we need to focus on education. We need to help members understand the impact of NIH and the need to be able to address this. Our advocacy efforts will be sort of moderated and changed based on some of the outcomes of the elections so that we can better understand what the likelihood of reintroduction and advancement are. So we're going to address some of those in our follow-up. We are tracking the continuing resolution, and we're going to keep an eye on what happens in December for the efforts there to pass a full year budget. And we expect that they will not include a consolidation this year. We are developing advanced toolkits and information and material with fact sheets, state-based fact sheets, as well as infographics and materials that are going to support our advocacy efforts and our education efforts next year. We're really going to focus on the key achievements that vision researchers have had And then we're also going to be working and preparing for long-term education and advocacy. I think it's important to understand that, as Stacy said, once this is in legislative text, it's not easily done away with. It is more likely to come up more frequently on an ongoing basis when something like this has already been introduced in Congress. And so we are going to continue to need to work with partners and stakeholders to sustain our education with policymakers and our advocacy efforts as we identify opportunities for that moving forward. We'll also want to look at identifying key opinion leaders for potential witness testimony or engagement should some of this advance with hearings or other opportunities in Congress to share stakeholder input. And then again, we want to make sure that we're keeping all of our stakeholders informed. So please make sure to follow up and sign up to follow the National Alliance for Eye and Vision Research on social media. Make sure you get our monthly newsletter updates as well. And I will stop there. I think we have a little bit of time for questions, so I'll welcome Judy and our colleagues from Bright Focus back on.
Okay, well, thank you, Dan, Stacy, and Pretty. That was an amazing presentation. Appreciate your time. We do now have some time for questions. So just as a reminder, feel free to submit your questions to the Q&A feature, and we'll answer as many as we can before the close of the hour. So we do have a couple questions, Dan, that came in during the presentation. I'll be happy to share with you now, and we can field as needed. So first question, what were the levels of funding received for eye research per year when NEI was an independent institute versus when NEI was part of the NINDS and not independent?
So that's a good question. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of great detailed data dating back to the 60s on exactly what levels of funding were when it was part of NINDS and it had blindness as part of their mission. It's not exactly clear how much of the funding was for vision out of that institute prior to the separation. However, and the National Eye Institute has grown significantly since its inception in the 60s. It was initially funded at a very modest level as a sort of entry-level institute, and has received substantial investment over that time between the 60s and today, where we're currently at just shy of $900 million for the National Eye Institute that is dedicated to vision research funding. The current proposal would consolidate that $900 million along with NINDS, their funding, and dental and cranial. They would combine those three budget lines under the current proposal, but it's not clear what the distinction or funding levels would be for each specific disease or condition or anything like that in the future. Stacy or Preeti, I don't know if you have anything to add.
No, I would just add that once they consolidate this is an efficiency move, and it would be hard to imagine that the level of funding would increase the way it has in the past few years. And I think we all know that that's not enough for vision research that's already being set aside for research today. But suffice it to say, I think part of the reason from the early days that NEI was created is because the science community and others really fought for an institute so that blindness and eye disease could begin to be addressed. It would be hard to imagine with a consolidation, both in terms of revenue and in terms of what Dan was talking about with setting priorities within departments, that it would go up.
Yeah, that sort of leans into some of the next questions that we have too. If the NEI combines with NIDCR and NINDS, will the funding be increased by 42 million per year? And will that 42 million be split evenly?
Yeah, and the truth is that that's the kind of thing that you just don't know. With a consolidation, you're going to have a new director that would come in. They would develop a new mission statement that would direct and sort of help identify where they would fund priorities. And without specific budget lines for vision, for dental cranial, for neuro and brain, and stroke, you're not going to have that same level of clarity that you do now. And that's something that we find very valuable because we know that there's consistency in that when you have dedicated funding for specific institutes like the National Eye Institute.
Moving on, then, will there be a limit set to how many contractors or full-time employees can work in each lab in the new combined institute? I go ahead and answer that too, Dan, if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah, I would just say there's not a lot of details in terms of what the structure of the institutes or how they would specifically take those modifications. Right now, they haven't gotten into those levels of details, at least not in legislative text. There have been some discussions about that, I think, at the report level and some of the white paper recommendations. But from a legislative text, the only thing that's on the table right now is the consolidation of all of the institutes from 27 down to 15. Some of the specifics of how they would implement that, what the impact would be on individual labs and research funding overall, even indirect rates, all of that, those things are yet to be determined in legislative text. There are recommendations in some of the reports that way.
Okay, just a couple more questions I think we can squeeze in before the hour closes. NEI's funding impacts vision research worldwide. Is there anything vision researchers outside of the US can do to support or oppose the consolidation?
I
Support
think,
the opposition of the consolidation. Sorry.
I think, working with your colleagues in the United States and your partners in the United States, I think making sure that you're supporting them and they're able to support you and helping members of Congress understand that vision research is funded globally. And I think that's really important. You're not going to necessarily be able to contact Congress in the same way that American citizens would be able to. But I think that being a part of some of ARVO's advocacy initiatives, getting engaged in some of those efforts, and identifying ways that you can support your US-based colleagues in those education and advocacy efforts would be very valuable. And I think that would be a great opportunity. And I see Shalewa just put some contact in there to be able to answer additional questions.
Another way to think about it, depending on what country someone may be coming from, is they may be able to point out what's not happening in their country because there's not enough eye research happening or being funded there, and why this is so valuable. So they may be able to spin it that way. And if there's a country that happens to be doing it better, then offer that in the analysis too, because that can have weight with some people.
Yeah, and I think that's actually about all that we have time for today. So I just wanted to thank you again, Dan, Stacy, and Pretty, for being part of today's discussion. Wraps up our webinar, and we appreciate everyone who attended and submitted questions. As Shalewa indicated, if you have any additional questions, please use the email address outreach@arvo.org and we will answer them. And just a friendly reminder, the recording will be available on Arvo Learn and Arvo's YouTube channel in the next 2 to 3 business days. Before we go, please do remember to fill out the survey at the end of the webinar, and your feedback does help us to create better webinars moving forward. And we hope everybody has an enjoyable rest of their day. Thank you for joining us.